Have you ever wondered how a country like Turkey, sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, speaks a Turkic language but shares more genetic similarities with Europeans and Middle Easterners than with Central Asians? It's a puzzle that's baffled historians, geneticists, and curious minds for years. What if I told you that the story of Turkish DNA is not just about genes, it's about ancient empires, forgotten migrations, and the invisible threads that connect us all? This isn't just a science lesson. It's a journey through time written in our very blood. Imagine standing in Anatolia thousands of years ago. The land is ancient, even by the standards of early civilizations. People from all directions, Africa, Asia, Europe, traveled through this bridge of continents. Some stayed, some moved on, but each left behind traces, not in monuments or artifacts, but in the DNA of the people who would come after them. Now, fast forward to modern-day Turkey. Scientists decided to decode this genetic mystery, analyzing the DNA of over 3,300 individuals from every corner of the country. What they found was astonishing. Turkish DNA isn't dominated by any single ancestry. Instead, it's like a vibrant mosaic, a blend of Balkan, Caucasus, Middle Eastern, and European influences, with just a small trace of Central Asian heritage. Yes, the language might be Turkic, but the genes tell a much more complex story. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Despite this rich mixture, Turkish people have unique genetic markers not found anywhere else in the world. Imagine that, entire genetic codes exclusive to Turkey. How did that happen? The answer lies in centuries of migrations, empires rising and falling, and communities blending together in ways that history books barely mention. And there's another twist. While Turkey's genetic roots spread far and wide, there's also a pattern of inbreeding in some regions, especially in the East. This isn't just a cultural fact, it's a scientific goldmine. Why? Because inbreeding increases the chances of rare genetic traits showing up, which helps researchers identify genes linked to diseases. It's like nature's way of highlighting the rarest pages in the genetic book. So, what does all of this mean? It means that Turkish DNA isn't just a story about the past. It's a living, breathing testament to human resilience, migration, and evolution. It shows us that identity isn't defined by one thing, language, culture, or even ancestry. It's a beautiful chaos of all these elements mixed together. And if you think this is just about Turkey, think again. The story of Turkish DNA is part of the larger human story. How we've all moved, mixed, and evolved together, no matter where we come from. Imagine Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, not just as a country on the map, but as a grand stage where countless civilizations have left their mark. Long before borders were drawn, before empires rose and fell, Anatolia was a bustling crossroads where humanity's great migration stories unfolded. But while history books tell us about the Hittites, Greeks, and Ottomans, Turkish DNA holds whispers of even older journeys, stories written not in ink, but in genes. Picture this, over 10,000 years ago, as humans spread out of Africa, Anatolia became a bridge between continents. Hunter-gatherers settled here, leaving behind traces of their existence. Then came waves of farmers from the Fertile Crescent, bringing agriculture and their DNA with them. Their genes mixed with the local populations, creating a unique blend that still exists in Turkish people today. But that was just the beginning. As centuries passed, Anatolia became a magnet for migrating peoples. The Bronze Age saw movements from the Caucasus and Iran, adding new genetic threads to the tapestry. Then came the mighty empires, the Hittites, the Greeks, the Romans, each leaving their mark not just on monuments, but deep within the DNA of the people. It's like layers of history stacked on top of each other, invisible to the eye but alive in every cell. But the story doesn't stop there. Around the 11th century, the Turkic tribes swept in from Central Asia. You'd think their arrival would dominate Turkish genetics, right? Surprisingly, that's not the case. Modern genetic studies show that Central Asian ancestry makes up only about 9 to 15% of Turkish DNA. The language changed, the culture evolved, but the genetic roots remain deeply Anatolian, intertwined with centuries of migrations from neighboring regions like the Balkans, the Middle East, and the Caucasus. What's even more fascinating is how recent migrations have continued to shape the genetic landscape. In the 20th century alone, Turkey saw waves of people moving from the Balkans, the Middle East, and within its own borders due to economic shifts and urbanization. This constant movement has blurred the lines between regional genetic differences, making Turkish DNA incredibly diverse yet strikingly unified. But why does this matter? Because hidden within this genetic mosaic are clues to understanding not just history, but health. The mix of ancient and recent genes affects everything from disease susceptibility to physical traits. It's like a genetic time capsule, holding secrets from the past that can help us unlock the mysteries of the present. So, the next time you hear the word Anatolia, think beyond maps and monuments. Think of it as humanity's ancient highway, where every traveler left behind a piece of their story. And those stories, they are still alive today, carried in the DNA of millions of people. When people think of Turkey, many immediately associate its roots with the Turkic tribes of Central Asia. After all, the name Turk itself hints at this ancient connection. But here's the twist. While the cultural and linguistic influence of the Turkic migrations is undeniable, the genetic story tells a much more unexpected tale. Imagine the 11th century, a time of epic journeys across vast steppes and rugged mountain ranges. The Seljuk Turks, a powerful Turkic tribe, moved westward from Central Asia, eventually establishing themselves in Anatolia. This migration changed the region's language, traditions, and even its political landscape. But did it rewrite the DNA of the people living there? Not exactly. Modern genetic studies have uncovered something surprising. Despite centuries of Turkic rule, Central Asian ancestry makes up only about 9 to 15% of the modern Turkish gene pool. That's right, while the language and culture shifted dramatically, the genetic footprint of those early Turkic migrants is relatively small. It's like adding a splash of dye to a vast ocean. The color changes slightly, but the essence of the water remains the same. So, how do we explain this? It comes down to something called cultural dominance without genetic replacement. The Turkic tribes were militarily and politically powerful, allowing their language and customs to spread rapidly. But instead of displacing the existing Anatolian populations, they blended in, marrying locals and merging cultures. Over generations, the Turkic identity became part of Anatolia's fabric, even though the genetic contribution remained modest. But there's more to the story. The Turkic influence isn't just about the Seljuks. Before them, waves of migration from Central Asia had already left subtle marks. And after them, the Ottoman Empire continued to bring diverse groups into Anatolia, further enriching the genetic tapestry. Even so, the deep roots of Anatolia's pre-Turkic civilizations, Hittites, Greeks, Romans, remain the dominant threads in the modern Turkish genome. Interestingly, when we look at the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, markers passed down through male and female lines, we see that the paternal gene flow from Central Asia is slightly stronger, ranging from 8.5% to 15.6%. This suggests that Turkic men, likely warriors and leaders, played a more prominent role in these early migrations, while local Anatolian women continued to pass on their genetic legacy. What's fascinating is how this genetic story mirrors Turkey's cultural identity today. A rich blend of influences where ancient Anatolian roots coexist with Turkic traditions. The language may be Turkic, the cuisine a fusion of East and West, but the DNA, it's a complex mosaic, woven from thousands of years of human history. So, the next time someone assumes that Turkish identity is purely Turkic, remember this. The real story is far more intricate. Turkey's DNA isn't defined by a single migration or a single culture. It's a masterpiece painted with the brushstrokes of countless civilizations, with Central Asia adding just one vibrant color to the canvas. Long before the echoes of Turkic warriors crossed into Anatolia, this land was already a vibrant cradle of human civilization. From the towering temples of Göbekli Tepe, often dubbed the world's oldest temple, to the bustling cities of the Hittites, Phrygians, and Lydians, Anatolia was a cultural crossroads where humanity's earliest stories unfolded. But here's the question, do the people of modern Turkey still carry the genetic legacy of these ancient civilizations? The answer lies deep within their DNA. Imagine peeling back the layers of history, not through dusty scrolls or weathered ruins, but through the very code written inside our cells. Recent genetic studies reveal something astonishing. The genetic signatures of Anatolia's ancient inhabitants are still alive and well in the Turkish population today. Despite the waves of migrations, conquests, and cultural shifts over millennia, the core of Anatolia's genetic identity has remained remarkably resilient. Let's start with the Neolithic Revolution, around 10,000 years ago, when early Anatolian farmers began cultivating crops and domesticating animals. These early agriculturalists didn't just change the course of human history. They also carried unique genetic markers that would spread into Europe during the Great Neolithic migrations. Modern Turks still carry a significant proportion of this ancient farmer DNA, linking them directly to the very pioneers of settled life. Fast forward to the Bronze Age, when mighty civilizations like the Hittites ruled central Anatolia. Their genetic footprint, though diluted over time, is still detectable in modern Turkish genomes. But here's the twist: the genetic influence isn't isolated to one ancient group. Instead, it's a complex mosaic woven from countless civilizations: Hettians, Hurrians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, all leaving behind threads in the fabric of Turkish DNA. What's even more fascinating is how these ancient genetic layers coexist with later influences. For example, while the arrival of Turkic tribes in the 11th century added new cultural and linguistic dimensions, the underlying genetic structure remained deeply rooted in Anatolia's prehistoric past. Studies show that up to 60 to 70% of the modern Turkish gene pool can be traced back to populations that lived in Anatolia long before the Turkic migrations. Even the mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to their children, reveals ancient continuity. This maternal lineage connects modern Turks not just to Central Asia but to the women who lived, farmed, and raised families in Anatolia thousands of years ago. Their genetic whispers are still part of the Turkish identity today. This enduring legacy isn't just about numbers and percentages. It's a testament to human resilience. While empires rise and fall, while languages evolve and borders shift, the story written in our DNA endures. Modern Turkey isn't just the heir to the Ottoman Empire or the Seljuk legacy. It's the living descendant of civilizations that stretch back to the dawn of human history. So, when you walk the streets of Istanbul or gaze at the ruins of Ephesus, you're not just standing on history. You're surrounded by it, woven into every strand of DNA carried by the people around you. Their genes tell a story of farmers and warriors, of poets and builders, of ancient gods and timeless dreams. Imagine standing at the crossroads of continents, where East meets West, where empires have risen and fallen, and where countless footsteps have left their mark, not just on the land, but deep within the DNA of its people. This is Turkey, a living testament to thousands of years of human migration, invasion, and settlement. But how exactly have these historical migrations shaped the genetic identity of modern Turks? The answer is more fascinating than you might expect. Let's rewind to the very beginning, when Anatolia, or Asia Minor as it was once called, was a key passageway during humanity's first great migration out of Africa. Early humans traversed this land en route to Europe and Asia, leaving behind traces of their genetic legacy. But this was just the start. Anatolia soon became a genetic melting pot, absorbing waves of migrations from every direction. Fast forward to the Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago. This was when early farmers from Anatolia embarked on one of the most transformative migrations in human history, spreading agriculture and their genes into Europe. But this wasn't a one-way street. As farming communities thrived, Anatolia continued to receive genetic input from neighboring regions, especially from the Caucasus and the ancient Levant. This created a unique blend of genetic signatures, some of which are still detectable in Turkish DNA today. Then came the Bronze Age, a time of bustling trade, cultural exchange, and, yes, more migration. The Hittites, one of Anatolia's earliest empires, interacted with civilizations across the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. Genetic studies show that even during this ancient era, Anatolia was far from isolated. The movement of people and ideas left an indelible mark on the region's genetic makeup, adding new layers to an already complex mosaic. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward to the 11th century, when Turkic tribes from Central Asia swept into Anatolia, bringing with them not just new languages and traditions, but also new genes. You might think this would have completely transformed the local gene pool. But here's the surprising part. While the cultural impact was profound, the genetic contribution was relatively modest. Studies reveal that only about 10 to 15% of the modern Turkish genome can be traced back to Central Asian ancestry. The majority of the genetic makeup remained rooted in the ancient populations of Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks, followed by the rise of the Ottoman Empire, brought even more genetic diversity. As the Ottoman Empire expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, it facilitated the movement of people across vast territories. Soldiers, merchants, scholars, and slaves moved freely within the empire's borders, further enriching the genetic landscape of Anatolia. Even today, Turkish DNA carries traces of these diverse interactions, from the Balkans to North Africa, from the Caucasus to the Arabian Peninsula. But migration didn't stop with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The 20th century saw significant population exchanges, especially during the Greco-Turkish population exchange in the 1920s, which led to the relocation of over 1 million people based on religious identity. Additionally, economic migrations within Turkey, people moving from rural eastern regions to urban centers in the West, have helped homogenize the gene pool, blending regional genetic differences over time. What's remarkable is how all these layers of migration, spanning tens of thousands of years, have created a genetic tapestry that's uniquely Turkish. Modern Turks carry the legacy of ancient Anatolian farmers, Bronze Age traders, Central Asian nomads, Mediterranean seafarers, and Ottoman subjects from across 3 continents. It's a rich, complex story written in the very code of life. So, the next time you hear someone describe Turkey as a bridge between East and West, remember, it's not just a metaphor. It's a scientific fact, etched into the DNA of its people. A bridge where history, culture, and genetics converge, creating one of the most fascinating human stories ever told. Imagine if your family tree didn't just branch out over generations but stretched across continents, blending cultures, histories, and identities. That's the story of Turkish DNA, a living mosaic crafted by thousands of years of admixture. But what exactly is admixture, and how did it shape the genetic landscape of Turkey into one of the most fascinating puzzles in human history? Admixture is the scientific term for the mixing of genetic material from different populations. Think of it like blending different colors of paint, each migration, conquest, or trade route adding a new hue to the canvas. Over time, these layers create a vibrant masterpiece. In Turkey, this masterpiece is unlike anywhere else on Earth. Why? Because Turkey isn't just a country, it's a historical crossroads. Positioned between Europe and Asia, bordered by the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Aegean, Anatolia has always been a magnet for human movement. Early humans passed through this land on their way out of Africa, leaving behind the first brushstrokes in the Turkish genetic story. But the real transformation began with the Neolithic Revolution, around 10,000 years ago. Back then, Anatolia wasn't just a stopover, it was the cradle of agriculture. Early farmers spread from here into Europe, carrying not just seeds but their genes. But while they moved west, waves of people from the Caucasus, Iran, and the Levant moved in, adding new layers to the gene pool. This continuous two-way migration created a genetic blend that's still detectable today. Fast forward to the Bronze and Iron Ages, when ancient civilizations like the Hittites, Phrygians, Greeks, and Eurasians thrived in Anatolia. Each brought new people, new cultures, and new genetic influences. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, from the Silk Road to maritime networks across the Mediterranean. With every merchant, sailor, and settler, another strand was woven into the Turkish genome. But perhaps the most defining wave of admixture came with the arrival of Turkic tribes from Central Asia around the 11th century. You might expect this to have completely transformed the genetic landscape. But here's where it gets interesting. While the Turkic language and culture became dominant, the genetic contribution from Central Asia was relatively modest, around 10 to 15%. Instead of replacing the existing population, the newcomers mixed with the locals, adding yet another layer to the mosaic. Then came the Ottoman Empire, a vast, multicultural state stretching from the Balkans to North Africa, from the Arabian Peninsula to Eastern Europe. The Ottomans didn't just conquer territories, they connected people. Soldiers, merchants, administrators, and scholars moved freely across the empire, bringing with them not just ideas and traditions but their DNA. This era saw Turkish genetics enriched by contributions from the Balkans, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Middle East. Even in modern times, the story of admixture continues. The 20th century saw massive population exchanges, like the 1923 Greco-Turkish population swap, and waves of internal migration driven by economic opportunities. People from rural Anatolia moved to urban centers like Istanbul, Izmir, and Ankara, blending once distinct regional gene pools into a more unified genetic identity. But what does all this mean for Turkish DNA today? Studies show that the average Turkish genome reflects a unique blend of ancestries: Balkan, Caucasian, Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and even traces of European and South Asian heritage. This isn't just academic data. It's a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the people who've lived here for millennia. What's even more fascinating is that this genetic mosaic isn't evenly mixed. Regional differences still exist. For example, people in eastern Turkey tend to have higher Caucasus and Middle Eastern ancestry, while those in the west show more Balkan and European influences. In the central regions, you'll find a stronger Central Asian genetic signal, a lingering echo of the Turkic migrations from centuries ago. And yet, despite this diversity, there's a surprising genetic cohesion among Turks. It's like a patchwork quilt where each piece is different, but together they form a unified whole. This is the beauty of admixture. It doesn't erase identities. It layers them, creating complexity, richness, and depth. So, when we talk about Turkish DNA, we're not just discussing genes. We're uncovering stories of migration, survival, and cultural exchange. Each strand of DNA is a thread in the larger fabric of human history, woven through Anatolia's mountains, coastlines, and bustling cities. Imagine looking at a family tree where the branches twist and curve, occasionally looping back on themselves. This isn't just a family history, it's a genetic roadmap, and in Turkey, it reveals fascinating patterns shaped by inbreeding and consanguinity. But what do these terms really mean, and how have they left clues hidden within Turkish DNA? Inbreeding refers to the reproduction between individuals who are closely related, while consanguinity specifically describes the union of people who share a common ancestor. In many parts of the world, consanguineous marriages, especially between first or second cousins, have been common cultural practices for centuries. Turkey is one of those places, with certain regions, particularly in the East, having higher rates of cousin marriages compared to Western countries. But why does this matter genetically? Because when individuals with shared ancestry have children, there's a higher chance that both parents carry the same genetic variants, some of which might be harmless, while others could increase the risk of inherited conditions. It's like flipping the same coin twice. The odds of getting heads both times are higher when the coin is the same. In genetic terms, this increases the likelihood of homozygosity, where a person inherits two identical copies of a gene from both parents. When researchers analyzed the Turkish genome, they found something striking. About 30% of individuals had high inbreeding coefficients, which means their DNA carried more identical gene pairs than expected in populations with more genetic mixing. Even more fascinating, they discovered runs of homozygosity, long stretches of DNA where both copies are exactly the same. Some of these runs were over 4 megabases long, which is unusually high compared to populations from Europe or Africa. In fact, these long runs were found almost exclusively in the Turkish population when compared to global genetic databases. What does this tell us? These patterns are genetic fingerprints of consanguineous marriages that have occurred over generations. But they are not just historical artifacts, they play a significant role in understanding genetic diseases. In populations with high levels of consanguinity, rare genetic disorders caused by recessive genes are more likely to appear. This is because both parents might unknowingly carry the same rare mutation, increasing the chance that their child inherits two copies of it. Interestingly, this phenomenon has a silver lining for scientific research. Populations with high rates of consanguinity, like parts of Turkey, offer unique opportunities to identify genes responsible for rare diseases. In fact, many gene discoveries that have advanced our understanding of human health have come from studying such populations. Turkish genetic studies have uncovered numerous loss-of-function mutations, genes that are essentially switched off because of mutations. These natural human knockouts provide invaluable insights into how certain genes work, much like removing a part from an engine to see what happens. But inbreeding doesn't just affect rare diseases. It can influence common health traits too, from height and cholesterol levels to susceptibility to conditions like diabetes or heart disease. For example, Turkish studies have shown that individuals with higher inbreeding coefficients may have distinct patterns in these traits compared to more outbred populations. The regional differences within Turkey add another layer of complexity. In the eastern provinces, where consanguineous marriages are more common, genetic studies reveal higher levels of homozygosity. In contrast, western regions, with more historical exposure to diverse migrations and less consanguinity, show greater genetic diversity. This creates a fascinating genetic map across the country, where ancient traditions intersect with modern science. It's also important to recognize that consanguinity is not unique to Turkey. It's a part of many cultures around the world, from the Middle East to South Asia. What makes Turkey particularly interesting is how this practice interacts with its rich history of migrations, conquests, and admixture. The result is a genetic landscape that's both deeply rooted and incredibly diverse. Understanding inbreeding and consanguinity isn't just about looking backward, it's about looking forward. By studying these genetic patterns, scientists can better predict disease risks, develop targeted treatments, and improve health outcomes, not just for Turkey, but for populations around the world. So, when we talk about Turkish DNA, we're not just unraveling the past, we're unlocking clues that could shape the future of medicine. It's a reminder that hidden within our genes are stories of our ancestors, our communities, and even the choices we make today. Imagine being able to trace the footsteps of ancient travelers, not through dusty maps or forgotten ruins, but through the very code that makes us who we are, our DNA. Turkish DNA holds the echoes of countless migrations, battles, and cultural exchanges, woven together over thousands of years. But how exactly does our genetic blueprint reveal this epic story? Let's embark on a journey through time, using Turkish DNA as our guide. Turkey sits at the crossroads of continents, Europe to the west, Asia to the east, and the Middle East to the south. This strategic location made it a natural bridge for human migration since prehistoric times. From early hunter-gatherers to mighty empires, waves of people passed through or settled in Anatolia, leaving traces of their existence embedded in the genetic fabric of modern-day Turks. When scientists analyzed the Turkish genome, they found genetic signatures that mirror this complex history. The first clues come from admixture, the blending of different genetic lineages. Turkish DNA shows clear signs of extensive admixture with neighboring populations, including those from the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. This isn't surprising when you consider that Anatolia was part of vast empires like the Hittites, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Ottomans, each bringing new waves of people and genes. But to truly understand these migrations, we need to go back even further, tens of thousands of years, to when early humans first left Africa. As these pioneers spread across the globe, some ventured into Anatolia. Ancient DNA studies suggest that early Anatolian farmers were key players in the Neolithic Revolution, which introduced agriculture to Europe. In fact, much of the European gene pool today can be traced back to these Anatolian ancestors who migrated westward around 8,000 years ago, bringing with them not just crops and tools, but their DNA. Fast forward to the Bronze Age, and Anatolia becomes a bustling hub of trade and cultural exchange. Genetic data reveals influences from the Caucasus and the Iranian plateau, reflecting connections with ancient civilizations like the Assyrians, Eurasians, and Persians. These migrations didn't just leave cultural artifacts, they left genetic imprints still detectable in modern Turks. One of the most significant genetic shifts occurred during the migration of Turkic tribes from Central Asia into Anatolia around the 11th century. You might expect this event to dominate Turkish DNA, but here's the twist. Genetic studies show that Central Asian ancestry in modern Turks accounts for only about 9 to 15% of the gene pool. This suggests that instead of replacing the local populations, the incoming Turks mixed with the existing Anatolian people, creating a unique genetic blend. It's like adding a new color to an already rich palette rather than painting over it entirely. Another layer of this genetic story comes from the Ottoman Empire, which spanned Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Ottoman period facilitated not just the movement of goods and ideas but also people. This era introduced new genetic contributions from the Balkans, the Arab world, and even sub-Saharan Africa, further enriching the Turkish gene pool. What's fascinating is how these migrations are reflected in specific regions of Turkey. For example, in the west, especially near the Aegean coast, there's a stronger genetic connection to European populations, likely due to historical ties with Greece and the Balkans. In the east, you'll find genetic links to the Caucasus and Central Asia, reflecting the ancient and medieval migrations across these borders. The south shows traces of Levantine ancestry, influenced by centuries of trade and cultural exchange with the Middle East. But migrations weren't just ancient history. In the 20th century, events like the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923, where nearly 2 million people were relocated based on their religious identity, also left genetic marks. Similarly, internal migrations within Turkey, from rural areas to urban centers during the industrialization period, helped blend regional genetic differences, contributing to the overall genetic homogeneity observed today. Scientists use powerful tools like principal component analysis, PCA, and admixture mapping to uncover these patterns. PCA plots genetic similarities and differences, revealing how Turkish individuals cluster close to populations from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, with a subtle pull toward Central Asia. Admixture mapping, on the other hand, breaks down the proportions of genetic ancestry from different regions, like piecing together a puzzle whose edges span continents. Even the tiniest fragments of DNA can tell migration stories. Take mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, inherited only from your mother and father, respectively. Mitochondrial DNA in Turks shows links to ancient European and Middle Eastern lineages, while Y chromosome studies reveal both local Anatolian roots and traces of Central Asian ancestry. These markers act like genetic time capsules, preserving the memory of migrations long after the travelers themselves have faded into history. So, what does all this mean? It means that every Turkish genome is a living museum, a collection of genetic artifacts from ancient farmers, Silk Road merchants, Ottoman soldiers, and countless others whose names we'll never know but whose legacy lives on in the blood of millions. It's a testament to human resilience, adaptation, and the interconnectedness of our species. When we explore Turkish DNA, we're not just uncovering Turkey's story, we're revealing a chapter in the broader saga of humanity. It's a reminder that we're all part of a grand journey that began in Africa, branched out across the globe, and continues to this day. Our genes carry the footprints of our ancestors, etched in the language of life itself. Imagine if you could see the threads of your ancestry woven into a colorful tapestry, each strand representing a different culture, a different people, and a different time in history. That's exactly what Turkish DNA is, a vibrant mosaic created by centuries of migration, conquest, trade, and intermingling. But what exactly makes this genetic puzzle so unique? It all comes down to a fascinating process called admixture. Admixture is the blending of distinct genetic lineages when previously separated populations come into contact and interbreed. It's like mixing different colors of paint. Each new shade tells a story of the colors that came before. In Turkey, this story is particularly rich because of its geographical position as a bridge between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Over millennia, waves of people have crossed this land, leaving their genetic footprints behind. When scientists analyzed the Turkish genome, they discovered that it carries signatures from diverse ancestral populations: Balkan, Caucasian, Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and even traces from Europe and South Asia. This genetic blend isn't just the result of ancient history. It reflects continuous layers of human movement, from prehistoric migrations to the rise and fall of empires. Let's break it down. One of the most prominent components of Turkish DNA comes from the Middle East. This makes sense considering that Anatolia was a cradle of early civilizations like the Hittites, Assyrians, and Persians. These ancient cultures didn't just share ideas and technologies, they also shared genes. The genetic influence from the Middle East is particularly strong in southeastern Turkey, reflecting thousands of years of cultural and demographic exchange. Next, we see the influence of the Balkans in Europe. During the time of the Roman and Byzantine empires, Anatolia was closely connected to Europe through politics, trade, and migration. Later, the Ottoman Empire further strengthened these ties, controlling vast territories in the Balkans for centuries. As a result, Turkish populations, especially in the western regions, show strong genetic links to the Balkans and southern Europe. But there's another key piece of this puzzle: Central Asia. The arrival of Turkic tribes from Central Asia in the 11th century marked a significant turning point in Anatolian history. These nomadic groups brought not only their language and culture but also their genes. However, here's the twist. Genetic studies show that Central Asian ancestry makes up only about 9 to 15% of the modern Turkish gene pool. This suggests that instead of replacing the existing populations, the Turkic newcomers mixed with the local Anatolian people, creating a unique genetic mosaic. Admixture patterns also reveal fascinating regional differences within Turkey. For example, in the Aegean and Marmara regions, you'll find a higher proportion of European ancestry, reflecting historical connections with Greece and the Balkans. In contrast, Eastern Turkey shows stronger genetic ties to the Caucasus and the Middle East, influenced by its proximity to Armenia, Georgia, and Iran. Meanwhile, the southern regions have notable Levantine ancestry, shaped by ancient trade routes and migrations along the Mediterranean coast. But how do scientists uncover these patterns? They use advanced genetic tools like admixture analysis, which breaks down an individual's genome into percentages that reflect different ancestral sources. Imagine looking at a pie chart where each slice represents a part of your ancestry. That's what admixture does. For Turkish individuals, these slices often include contributions from the Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, and beyond. Another powerful tool is principal component analysis, PCA, which plots genetic similarities and differences among populations. When Turkish genomes are plotted alongside those from neighboring regions, they cluster closely with Balkan, Caucasian, and Middle Eastern groups, reflecting their shared history. But they also form a distinct group, highlighting Turkey's unique genetic identity shaped by its rich history of admixture. What's truly remarkable is that Turkish DNA doesn't just tell a story of ancient history. It also reflects more recent events. The population exchanges between Greece and Turkey in the early 20th century, the migration of Balkan Muslims during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and internal migrations within Turkey due to urbanization. All these events have left genetic imprints that are still detectable today. Even the tiniest fragments of DNA, like mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, reveal admixture stories. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mothers, shows links to both European and Middle Eastern lineages. The Y chromosome, inherited from fathers, reveals connections to Central Asia, the Caucasus, and local Anatolian populations. These genetic markers act like historical records, preserving the memory of migrations and intermarriages long after the people themselves have vanished. But admixture isn't just about percentages and pie charts, it's about people. It's about the farmers who crossed the Aegean Sea 8,000 years ago, bringing agriculture to Europe. It's about the Silk Road traders who carried not just goods but also genes across continents. It's about the soldiers, settlers, and families who lived, loved, and left their mark on Anatolia's genetic landscape. In fact, admixture has even shaped the health and diversity of the Turkish population. The blending of different gene pools can introduce new genetic variations, some of which may influence susceptibility to diseases or response to medications. That's why understanding admixture isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. It has real-world implications for medical research and personalized healthcare. So, when we talk about Turkish DNA, we're not just describing a static snapshot of genetics. We're looking at a dynamic, ever-evolving mosaic that reflects the journeys, encounters, and stories of countless generations. It's a living testament to the idea that our identities are not confined by borders but enriched by connections that stretch across continents and through time. Imagine tossing a handful of colorful beads into the wind. Some scatter far and wide, while others cluster closely together. Over time, the beads left behind form a unique pattern, random, yet shaped by the forces that carried them. This simple analogy helps us understand a powerful force in genetics known as genetic drift. In the story of Turkish DNA, genetic drift has played a subtle yet profound role, sculpting the genetic landscape we see today. But what exactly is genetic drift? In the simplest terms, it's the random change in the frequency of genetic variants in a population over generations. Unlike natural selection, which favors traits that offer survival advantages, genetic drift is all about chance. It's like flipping a coin. Sometimes heads will appear more often, not because it's better, but just because of randomness. In small populations, these random fluctuations can have dramatic effects, even causing certain genetic traits to disappear entirely while others become fixed. Now, let's bring this concept to Turkey, a land that has been both a cradle of civilizations and a crossroads of continents. Throughout its history, Anatolia has experienced countless waves of migration, invasions, population bottlenecks, and isolated communities. Each of these events created opportunities for genetic drift to leave its mark. Take, for instance, ancient population bottlenecks. When large populations shrink dramatically, due to disasters, wars, or migrations, the genetic diversity within that group can plummet. The survivors pass on only a fraction of the original gene pool, and by pure chance, some genetic variants are lost forever while others become more common. This founder effect has shaped many isolated populations around the world, and Turkey is no exception. Consider the early Neolithic farmers who settled in Anatolia around 10,000 years ago. These pioneers carried with them a specific set of genetic traits from their ancestral homelands in the Fertile Crescent. As they spread westward into Europe, genetic drift magnified certain traits simply because these small farming communities were isolated from one another. Interestingly, traces of these early genetic markers are still detectable in modern Turkish DNA, acting like ancient signatures written in our genes. But genetic drift isn't just ancient history. It's an ongoing process. In fact, when scientists analyzed Turkish genomes, they found clear signs of drift, especially in regions where populations remained relatively isolated for long periods. For example, small mountain villages in eastern Anatolia or remote coastal communities along the Black Sea show unique genetic patterns that differ from the more cosmopolitan cities like Istanbul or Ankara. This is because, in these isolated communities, genetic drift has had a stronger influence, allowing rare variants to persist or even become common over generations. One striking example is the presence of runs of homozygosity, ROH, in Turkish DNA. Rows are long stretches of identical genetic material inherited from both parents, often the result of small population sizes, inbreeding, or historical isolation. In Turkey, researchers discovered that rows longer than 4 megabases are found exclusively in the Turkish population compared to global datasets like the 1000 Genomes Project. This suggests that genetic drift, combined with historical population structures and consanguinity in certain regions, has played a significant role in shaping the Turkish genome. Genetic drift also helps explain why certain rare genetic diseases are more prevalent in specific Turkish communities. In small populations, even harmful mutations can become common simply due to chance. For example, some hereditary disorders linked to recessive genes, like certain metabolic or neurological conditions, are found at higher rates in regions with historical population bottlenecks or high levels of consanguinity. Understanding these patterns isn't just about history. It has real implications for public health and genetic counseling in Turkey today. Another fascinating aspect of genetic drift is how it interacts with admixture. Remember, Turkey's genetic landscape is a mosaic influenced by migrations from Central Asia, the Middle East, the Balkans, and beyond. When these diverse groups mixed, new genetic variants entered the population. However, over generations, genetic drift caused some of these variants to become more common while others faded away. This explains why, despite centuries of Turkic migrations from Central Asia, the Central Asian genetic contribution to modern Turkish DNA is relatively modest, about 9 to 15%. Drift has reshaped the gene pool, blending ancient Anatolian, Middle Eastern, and European influences with more recent Turkic threads. But here's the twist: genetic drift doesn't act uniformly. Its effects can vary even within the same country. In Turkey, for instance, western regions like the Aegean coast show genetic patterns influenced more by Europe and the Balkans, while eastern regions have stronger ties to the Caucasus and the Middle East. These differences aren't just due to who migrated where. They are also the result of genetic drift amplifying certain traits in local populations over time. Scientists measure the impact of genetic drift using tools like FST values, which compare genetic differences between populations. In Turkey, FST analyses reveal that the genetic distance between Turkish subregions is relatively low, reflecting a high degree of internal mixing. However, when comparing Turkey to neighboring regions, subtle differences emerge, highlighting the role of drift in shaping distinct genetic identities despite geographical proximity. Another powerful tool is the construction of phylogenetic trees, essentially family trees for populations. When researchers created these trees using Turkish genetic data, they found that Turkey acts as a genetic bridge between Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Yet, within this bridge, distinct branches reflect the influence of drift, with Turkish samples forming unique clusters that set them apart from neighboring groups. But perhaps the most captivating story genetic drift tells is one of resilience. Despite the randomness of this process, the Turkish genome has preserved echoes of ancient civilizations, migrations, and historical events. From the genes of Neolithic farmers to the legacy of the Silk Road, from the rise of the Ottoman Empire to modern urbanization, every twist and turn in Turkey's history has left a genetic imprint, subtly shaped by the winds of drift. In a way, understanding genetic drift is like appreciating the beauty of a mosaic. Each tiny piece may seem random on its own, but together, they form a picture that tells a story of survival, adaptation, and connection. Turkish DNA is that mosaic, and genetic drift is one of the invisible hands that help craft it. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Istanbul, where ancient architecture stands alongside modern skyscrapers. The aroma of spices fills the air, echoes of diverse languages blend together, and every corner seems to whisper stories from the past. But what if I told you that these stories aren't just etched in stone or written in history books? They are also written in the very DNA of the people walking those streets today. The genetic makeup of modern Turks is a living archive of historical events, migrations, and cultural transformations that have shaped Anatolia for thousands of years. Turkey's unique position as a bridge between continents, linking Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, has made it a melting pot of civilizations. But beyond the cultural fusion, it has also been a genetic crossroads. The DNA of modern Turks carries the echoes of ancient empires, epic migrations, and pivotal historical events that left lasting imprints on the genetic landscape. Let's begin at the dawn of human history. During the Paleolithic period, Anatolia served as a key migration route for early humans leaving Africa. These first settlers laid the foundation of the region's genetic pool. But it was the Neolithic Revolution, around 10,000 years ago, that truly set the stage for profound genetic shifts. Early farmers from the Fertile Crescent, modern-day regions of Iraq and Syria, migrated into Anatolia, bringing not just agricultural practices but also their genes. These Neolithic farmers intermingled with local hunter-gatherers, creating one of the earliest genetic mosaics in human history. Fast forward to the Bronze Age, and Anatolia becomes a vibrant hub for trade and cultural exchange. Civilizations like the Hittites, Assyrians, and Eurasians rose and fell, each leaving subtle genetic footprints. Gene flow during this period wasn't just a result of conquest. It also happened through trade routes, intermarriage, and the movement of artisans, merchants, and soldiers across regions. But one of the most transformative events in Turkish genetic history was the arrival of the Turkic peoples from Central Asia. Starting around the 6th century, waves of Turkic tribes migrated westward, culminating in the establishment of the Seljuk Empire in the 11th century and later the mighty Ottoman Empire. You might expect that these migrations would have completely overhauled the genetic landscape of Anatolia. However, modern genetic studies reveal a fascinating truth. While Turkic migrations left a significant cultural and linguistic impact, their genetic contribution to the modern Turkish population is relatively modest, about 9 to 15%. This is because the incoming Turkic groups intermarried with the existing Anatolian populations rather than replacing them, blending into an already diverse genetic tapestry. The Ottoman Empire itself played a pivotal role in shaping Turkish genetics. Stretching across 3 continents at its peak, the empire facilitated the movement of people from the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa, and even parts of Eastern Europe into Anatolia. Soldiers, scholars, merchants, and slaves from across the empire's vast territories contributed to the gene pool. This period of extensive admixture is evident in the genetic closeness between modern Turks and populations from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East. One particularly striking example of historical impact is the genetic legacy of the Balkan migrations during the early 20th century. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and subsequent population exchanges, hundreds of thousands of people from the Balkans settled in western Anatolia. Today, the genetic signature of these migrations is still detectable, especially in regions like Izmir and Edirne, where Balkan ancestry remains prominent. Internal migrations within Turkey have also shaped its genetic landscape. Economic shifts, urbanization, and political changes over the past 2 centuries prompted large-scale movements from eastern and rural Anatolia to urban centers like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir. These migrations contributed to a gradual genetic homogenization across the country, reducing the stark differences that might have existed between isolated communities in the past. This is why, When scientists analyze Turkish DNA today, they find a surprisingly high degree of genetic similarity among individuals from different regions, despite Turkey's vast geographical and cultural diversity. However, remnants of ancient population structures still exist. For example, in more isolated regions, such as remote mountain villages in eastern Anatolia or along the Black Sea coast, unique genetic patterns persist. These areas often show higher levels of genetic drift and inbreeding, which have preserved rare genetic variants that might have been diluted in more cosmopolitan areas. This explains the presence of long runs of homozygosity, ROH, in certain Turkish populations, a genetic marker often linked to historical isolation and consanguinity. Another fascinating layer of Turkey's genetic story comes from ancient DNA studies. By comparing modern Turkish genomes with ancient samples from archaeological sites across Anatolia, scientists have traced back lineages to early Anatolian farmers, Bronze Age civilizations, and even prehistoric hunter-gatherers. These studies reveal that while modern Turks carry a rich mosaic of genetic influences, there is also a strong continuity with the region's ancient inhabitants. In other words, despite all the migrations, invasions, and empires, a deep-rooted Anatolian genetic signature remains. Historical events also left their mark on Turkish genetics through selective pressures. For example, certain genetic traits related to diet, disease resistance, and environmental adaptation became more prevalent over time. The spread of agriculture during the Neolithic period likely influenced genes related to lactose tolerance, while the dense urban environments of the Ottoman era may have shaped immune system genes due to exposure to various pathogens. Moreover, the practice of consanguineous marriages, particularly in rural areas, has had a significant impact on the genetic landscape. High rates of cousin marriages have increased the frequency of certain recessive genetic disorders, making Turkey an important population for studying rare genetic diseases. In fact, the Turkish Variome, a comprehensive catalogue of genetic variants in the Turkish population, has been invaluable for identifying disease-causing mutations and understanding the genetic basis of inherited conditions. But history isn't just about the past. It's an ongoing process. The modern era of globalization, increased migration, and cultural exchange continues to shape Turkish genetics. New waves of immigration, including recent influxes from Syria and other neighboring regions, are adding fresh layers to Turkey's genetic mosaic. In the future, genetic studies will likely reveal even more about how contemporary events influence the Turkish genome. In essence, the story of Turkish genetics is like a palimpsest, a manuscript written over many times, with traces of each previous text still visible beneath the surface. From ancient Anatolian farmers to Ottoman traders, from Central Asian nomads to modern urban dwellers, every chapter of Turkey's history has left its mark in the DNA of its people. As we journey deeper into the genetic tapestry of Turkey, it's impossible to ignore the colossal influence of the Ottoman Empire, a civilization that redefined not just borders but the very DNA of the populations it touched. Stretching across 3 continents, from the Balkans to North Africa and deep into the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and, most intriguingly, genes. But how exactly did this vast empire leave its mark on the genetic structure of modern-day Turkey? The Ottoman Empire wasn't just an empire of conquests. It was an empire of migrations. Soldiers, merchants, scholars, and artisans moved freely across its territories, creating an unprecedented flow of people, and with them, their genetic material. This dynamic movement led to extensive admixture, blending the genes of Balkan, Caucasus, Middle Eastern, North African, and Central Asian populations. The echoes of these migrations are still found in the genomes of Turkish people today. Studies have shown that Turkish DNA carries genetic signatures closely linked to Balkan and Caucasus populations, reflecting the deep-rooted historical connections fostered during Ottoman rule. But the story gets even more fascinating when we look at specific genetic markers. For example, Y chromosome haplogroups common in the Balkans, such as I2A, are significantly present in Western Turkey, a direct genetic imprint of Ottoman-era migrations and settlements. Similarly, mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, passed down through maternal lines, reveal connections with populations from the Levant and North Africa, indicating the diverse origins of the people who lived within the empire's vast territories. The Ottoman policy of population resettlement, known as Surgan, played a pivotal role in shaping this genetic diversity. Entire communities were relocated from one part of the empire to another to maintain control and stimulate economic growth. This wasn't just political strategy. It was genetic reshaping on a massive scale. Imagine families from the Balkans settling in Anatolia, or people from the Arabian Peninsula establishing roots in the heart of Istanbul. Each migration added new threads to the complex genetic fabric of Turkey. Yet, while the Ottoman Empire fostered genetic diversity, it also influenced patterns of inbreeding. In some regions, especially within elite circles and isolated communities, consanguineous marriages were common, a practice that has left detectable marks in the form of long runs of homozygosity in the Turkish genome. These genetic patterns help us understand not just who the ancestors were but how they lived, interacted, and built the society that would eventually become modern Turkey. The genetic legacy of the Ottoman Empire is like an ancient map etched into the DNA of millions. It tells stories of sultans and soldiers, merchants and migrants, of bustling bazaars where languages mixed as freely as bloodlines. And as we decode these genetic stories, we're not just uncovering history, we're discovering how deeply the past lives within us.